Hi, I'm Brad Newcombe, and you're watching Pressure Point. I think most groups in society run the risk of being stereotyped, either by the media or other groups or individuals. But few of us have had to endure the kind of stereotyping that Aboriginal people have encountered and still do encounter. Well, on this program, we're going to talk about breaking Aboriginal stereotypes, and my guests are Leslie Nelson, who is an employment counsellor, and Linda Dumas, who is a life skills coach. So welcome to both of you.
Hi, Brad. Thank you.
Good to have you here. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Aboriginal stereotypes and so on, but I think what I'd like to know a little bit, first of all, is just a little bit about yourselves, you know, where you grew up and how you got to sort of be where you are and do what you do now. So, Linda?
Well, let me see. I grew up, I've been born and raised in British Columbia. I'm Métis, so I'm not treaty. And French and Cree is my cultural background. However, I was brought up in a white world. I was raised in a Catholic, brought up Catholic, and I didn't learn my language, either language, French or Cree. And when I started school, my parents moved to the west coast, to the mainland, and lower mainland, and when we moved to Surrey is when I started realizing I was different. And there wasn't very many visual minorities in Surrey at that time, so I was quite the novelty, and not in a good way. It wasn't good experiences I had at that age, and still didn't understand a lot. I've actually just been researching and getting sort of comfortable in my own skin, researching my culture for the last 10 years.
Really?
So some of it's new to me. The stereotyping, however, isn't. Not at all.
I just want to, when you said you're not treaty and you're Métis, explain a little bit about that, just to help me understand the difference.
Okay. When you identify as an Aboriginal in Canada, you have choices of identifying yourself as status, which is on reserve treaty Aboriginal. So they are registered with the government as full Native, and they get some of these perks. So they don't pay taxes if they work or live on reserve. Then there's non-status Aboriginal people, and they don't have that status either, but they're Aboriginal, and for some reason, somewhere down the line, they left reserve and they're not registered with any reserve. And then there's Métis, which is the mixed blood ancestry, and that's what I am. And there's Inuit, and I believe it's those 4 categories that are recognized constitutionally in Canada as Aboriginal to this land.
Okay. Leslie, a little bit about yourself and your background.
All right. I was born in Bonnyville, Alberta, and I grew up in a small town, Grant Center, for the first 10 years of my life. And we were one of 2 Native families that were in that town. And I moved to Edmonton when I was 10 years old. And at that time was when I experienced a lot of discrimination, a lot of stereotypes. And to go further on into my life, in 1991, I moved here to the Lower Mainland to find more of who I am and to have my own, I think just to find myself and to live the way that I want to live. So it was breaking away from the family, which also was a part of my breaking stereotypes. But I identify myself as Métis, and sometimes I identify as a half-breed. The difference between that is originally Métis were French and Cree Indian, or French and Indian, and myself, my father's English, and because of that I'm identified as a half-breed. And
now, half-breed, is that your terminology, or is that terminology that someone else uses? Or
that's a terminology that Greater Society has used to identify mixed blood who are half English,
Right, okay.
because Métis is a French word. That's right.
Oh, I see. Okay. Now it's interesting. In both of your, when I hear you tell your stories from from your early days on, it sounds to me like there was an early period where you were not aware of discrimination. Like you mentioned that that it was a certain point when you realized, you said that you were different, and you also said that you experienced. Is that a correct observation?
It is.
It is.
That must have been an incredible shock. I mean, to your
Well,
world.
yes, for me it was. I grew up in a very friendly and a very small town where the population may have been, in the beginning, perhaps 1,000 people. And at that point, my friends, I didn't differentiate from my friends. They were, most of them were Caucasian, and I didn't differentiate myself from them. It wasn't until I had moved to a larger metropolis, Edmonton, where I began to experience absolute discrimination, and it happened within the first week that I had gone to school, where I'd gotten into a fight with some Caucasian boys, and it was more than one against me, and as a result I had found myself becoming more withdrawn in school, and at that point my grades pretty much crashed.
Yeah. And can you say a little bit about that before and after, Linda? How that changed you? I mean, how that impacted you?
My father and mother, well, our family traveled throughout BC when I was small, from the time I can remember, because my father worked for, I don't know, those big companies, Dominion Foundation, as the highways and the bridges and the dams were going into northern BC. So we lived in small towns. I was born in Princeton, sister born in Creston, and I just, I vaguely remember calling certain people auntie and uncle, and they weren't Native people, and so there wasn't a community of them, and as a family we didn't associate with them, and I don't remember meeting any of my extended family till I was older. I was 8 and living in Surrey already when I first met my grandfather on my mother's side, and he was very obviously an Aboriginal man, and by then I'd already started experiencing prejudice in school. I did not have a friend in school till I was in grade 3, because by that time I was very withdrawn. Kids, the younger I was, I think, is when it was most cruel, and that's when I started school. And like I said, it was a novelty, because I was just very different from everyone else.
Right. And difference, of course, is often discriminated against. It's not accepted. Say a little bit about the stereotypes then that impact Aboriginal people generally. I mean,
For myself, first of all, I want to address one part of it, is that when I had grown up, I had always heard the terms Indian, Native, Métis, half-breed. Those terms were what I had heard, even the term Aboriginal, when I was growing up. And then I hadn't heard the term First Nations till I moved here to the West Coast. So I associate that with West Coast Native people, that they refer to themselves as First Nations. And so that's a big difference for me, to have people call me First Nations. I'm not insulted in any way by any of that reference, whether someone calls me an Indian or whether they call me Native, because for me I just accept the fact that that's how they see me, and it's not meant to hurt me, or it's not meant as derogatory. So I see fully that people just learn different ways of how to address other people.
It seems to me that there's different kinds of stereotypes. I mean, some of them are quite disparaging. I mean, First Nations or Aboriginal people, take a lot of money and don't pay taxes and those kinds of things. I mean, those are attitudes that are out there, and you hear a lot of really awful comments. And then there's another side too. There's the kind of New Age sort of thing where Natives are very close to the earth and to nature, and there's a kind of a desperate search and desire to adopt Native spirituality and a oneness with the earth and with all creation. Now, can you comment? I mean, those are two extremes, but can you comment on those and everything in between?
Well, Leslie and I were just recently having a conversation about just those sorts of things, and I kind of chalk them up as pet peeves of the, it's not the industry, it's who I am, but we often face that, or I have had people say to me in joking manner or in derogatory manner, oh, you don't have to pay any taxes, or you don't have any problems, you're Aboriginal or you're Indian, and you can get this for free or that for free, your education. And it's not so. It isn't, and if you're not working on reserve with status or living on reserve, you pay taxes. I've always paid taxes. I haven't had a trip to Hawaii either.
Right, okay.
And that's another one that we get. We have these wonderful escapades down there to learn things, but no, none of that is so, and it has become more of a pet peeve. In the beginning, I felt a lot more anger, but what I realize is it's people's ignorance. They only see and know what they're fed from the media.
Right.
And it's the stories about the ones that have misappropriated funds that they get the information about. And then there's the other ones where people will say to me, oh, I was walking in the park today and this eagle flew over me, and so what does that mean? And it's like, well, it means an eagle flew over you.
That's exactly what I would say too.
Yes.
And sometimes I feel, because I'm just learning about my own culture, there have been times where I feel inadequate when I can't answer some of the questions. And there's just this idea out there, because I have Cree blood, or I don't know what it is, that I should know these things. And of course, when you don't, it's like, oh, what's wrong with me?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I find that oftentimes people will ask me a question, and I think that they're waiting for the sage word to come out of me, that I've got the answers for them, but I really don't. Another large part of it is, as being a Native person, I don't have any rights, any more rights than what a mainstream Canadian does. I don't get income tax-free dollars when I work. I've never lived on a reserve. I've paid for my own education, and I was very fortunate to have such a wonderful mother who supported 9 children to go through school. And those sorts of things are misconceptions when they think that I've never taken out a student loan, because that's how I've paid for my own education.
Now, you mentioned that, I heard you say the word anger. I mean, it's obviously, I can understand how, especially when you think of movies and television, and when you read some of those reports in the newspaper, which obviously have a bias and there's slants, and there, as you say, there can be misappropriation of funds from any group of people, and there is in any group of people. So it's frustrating, and what do you do with the anger when you sort of have to live with these ongoing stereotypes? Where do you put that, or how do you get over it, or what?
Talking with Leslie. Talking with Leslie, or somebody talking about it and finding out what they're experiencing, that I'm not alone with it, and that it's not just directed at me.
Or why those feelings are coming up, and exploring, like, where does that come from, and why do I feel this way towards that type of comment, and not necessarily towards that person, but why did that comment hurt me so badly?
How do you, I'm not sure how any of us does this, but if you hear it coming from someone else, and you're in a group, and the other thing is, you could be in a group and that they could be saying something about Aboriginal people, and they don't know that you're Aboriginal too, and then somebody's saying something about Indians and so on. How do you respond then, or if I'm in a group, maybe I'm with you and I hear someone saying, what's the best, are there any ways, any pointers, any clues we can have to sort of how you intervene and say something?
Well, for me, I think that sometimes it just depends on what's being said. Oftentimes, for me, it's not about me. It's about the person who's making the comments.
Right.
And sometimes I may interject to perhaps raise consciousness there, or I might interject to dispel a stereotype. However, I don't do that on a regular basis or anything. I sometimes leave people to be where they're at that time, because that's where they're at, and there's no changing it, at least not at no immediate future. However, if someone broaches it with me and decides that they're going to perhaps question something about my heritage or that, I'm very willing to speak freely about who I am and what my background is, and perhaps help to educate.
What about discrimination within the Aboriginal community itself?
Oh,
Does that happen?
yes, absolutely. Okay. I had, when I was living in Edmonton, I had done a number of years of volunteer work with First Nations people, and particularly with one group, which was a dance society, and had applied for employment with other Native groups to help to support me while I'd done the volunteer work. And I found a very difficult time getting into that field of work, simply because I didn't know anybody. And so there's a lot of nepotism within Aboriginal society. And if your family is a large family and they perhaps head one of the organizations, you can believe that most of the people working there will not necessarily have the experience or the education, but they will have the name to fit into there.
Right. You know, for a lot of us too, there's in Canada, a lot of us that have been here for generations. There's a lot of different blood mixed with all kinds of people, so that, you know, many of us have Aboriginal blood and have English and French blood and so on, which means that we can be born. You know, we all have different genetic makeups, and we all come out looking different ways, you know?
That's right.
And often, I mean, my understanding would be that discrimination often is based on sometimes appearance.
Right.
Does that happen in the Aboriginal community and so on? I mean, do people get judged according to, like you mentioned that when you went to Surrey, it was mostly Caucasians, and then you were sort of a novelty. So,
and I wasn't mistaken when I was very young for an Aboriginal person either. I was mistaken for an Oriental person.
Right. And
so most of the discrimination and all the, you know, the horrible things that were said were directed in that way. It wasn't until I was in my teens, and then I spent time in White Rock. There was a reserve there in White Rock, and being dark and having long hair, and that's then that I started being recognized, I guess, as Aboriginal. But within the community, there's different degrees, for sure, and that's, we were just talking again the other night with a friend of Leslie's who does not look Aboriginal at all, yet she's every bit, you know, Métis as we are, and finds herself sometimes having to prove that, or being set up so in such a way that people question her, and in a doubtful way.
And part of the response towards her is, it almost seems like, well, yes, everybody's trying to fit into the Native community nowadays, and everyone has a grandmother who is, you know, First Nations or something. However, you know, for myself, when I was growing up, I didn't realize anything about my background, because at that time there was not pride in being First Nations or being an Indian person. And I found that I grew up in ignorance myself, not knowing much about who I was. And when I realized that I was a Métis person, I was under the impression that I had come from the Cherokee tribe, I guess because Cherokee was so glamorized at the time, and they were like the noble ones on the plains and so forth. However, I later discovered that I am actually Cree.
Right, okay.
So it was a lot of, for myself, it too was educational. And what I've learned about myself, I've learned mostly through books and having to finally go back into my community and talk to my relatives who knew a little bit more about who we were than what I had known. So a lot of my education is about who I am, is taken from books. And today I design and make clothing, traditional dance regalia for dancers, men and women, and I learned that from books, and a lot of it comes from just an instinctual method of creation.
What kind of experience is that, to sort of recreate some of your past through study and history and books and so on? And I mean, obviously you're passionate about it, but just what's that like?
I find that to be, it really grounds me, and it's very fulfilling. There is a lot there that you can be as creative as you want to be, and I find that a lot of it is a new experience, because sometimes I may be working with bones, I may be working with feathers, I may be working with leather. I may at times work with different types of traditional, like Aboriginal tanned hides, and they're smoke tanned hides, and I find that they're as supple as cloth, and you can go to Tandy's and buy a piece of leather, but it's nothing compares to what is Aboriginal tanned hide, and in terms of working with it. So I find that the creativity that flows out of me, and you complete a project and you beam inside and say, this is beautiful. And it's something that you only see sometimes in books, and then all of a sudden your hand is creating it.
Wow, that's wonderful. How about you, Linda? What's that like for you to recreate some of or to go back and look for your roots?
It's, I find it exciting, and like Leslie says, I find a balance there, because I felt out of balance, not being connected, I guess what it was, and I feel connected. I have a great pride in learning what I do, and I'm just starting now to learn the language. I've tried some beading, and all of that is creative, but more so for me, the journey of getting comfortable in my skin is how I like to put it, because for so long I wasn't. And so finding out and talking and enjoying, going to a powwow and listening to the drums, feeling connected. And with that, it's opened up the door also for me to recognize that I am Métis, and that there's another rich culture that I can also enjoy, and it's so readily available to me in Canada, and that's the French.
Yeah.
So there's...
Who were here before the English.
Yes.
That's right.
So it's very exciting for me, and there's a real richness and fulfillment in being able to do this.
Yeah.
This started for me in my 40s, this journey of finding myself. So now with grown children, I can take all the time in the world, and I'm really enjoying it.
That's wonderful. And there's been quite a sea change, really, when we think of sort of breaking Aboriginal stereotypes. When I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, you know, on the movies and TV shows, I mean, it was cowboys and Indians. And I mean, I remember then thinking, well, it's not a very good portrayal. I mean, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist. As a little kid, I thought, you know, because it was just imbalanced, but it was there, pervasive all the time. Now we see, you know, the Canadian government, for instance, often when they're presenting gifts and awards and so on, I mean, they're often native sculptures, native paintings, native carvings, and so on. So there's been a much greater appreciation and respect, but I know that's been a long, painful journey. Have you seen this same kind of sea change, or is it a bit cosmetic at this point too? I mean, is it?
My feeling on that is that it is. I think, you know, and this is just my simple opinion, but we are, with the UN and everything, Canada's a peace giving, and the finger's been pointed at them a few times for what they're doing in their own backyard with their Aboriginal people. So it sure looks good if they're giving out, you know, Aboriginal crafts and that for gifts. And that's where I sit with it, because I don't understand it sometimes. To me, it doesn't always suit the picture. It's not the most appropriate gift, but it's the one they give. Right. And I find myself being really curious about that a lot of times.
And the reality is, for a lot of Aboriginal people, that life is not easy, and I mean, there's a lot of reserves and so on, where I mean, it's virtually third world conditions in Canada.
Exactly.
Well, one of the things for me is I work with youth in an employment program, and I find that one of the things that really bothers me is discrimination, and that doesn't necessarily have to be against me, but just discrimination in general. And oftentimes you hear people talking about other minority groups, like perhaps East Indians or Asians, and one of the comments that come across is, you know, you're not welcome here, go back to your own country, Asians are taking our jobs, that sorts of comments. And for me, you know, I'm a First Nations person, I'm Aboriginal, and I think that I have the right to say that it doesn't matter where you come from, you're welcome to be here in this country. And I would like that message to be out there, that when it comes to opening up this vast, beautiful country to other races of people, I think that that's probably one of the greatest things that we could do, is to welcome new cultures and welcome new people to this land and let it develop and grow into a, you know, a diverse race of human beings that can perhaps continue to provide peace and support to less fortunate countries in the world.
And of course we are. I mean, we're a country of people who've come from somewhere, I mean, but Aboriginal people were here, and then the people have come and different groups, and we're just here at different time frames, aren't we?
We are. If the French and the Cree hadn't come, or the French and the English hadn't come here to this country to begin with, neither Linda or I would have been born.
That's right, so we need each other. We're out of time, but I want to thank you for sharing both your personal lives and also your insights. It's been really great to talk to both of you.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've been talking with Leslie Nelson and Linda Dumas. We've been talking about breaking Aboriginal stereotypes. Thanks for joining us on Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe. So now we'll just sort of chat.